Hey everybody, some gadget guy here with another Showdown fight for blood! Pitting the Lumia 640XL against the Alcatel One-Touch Idol 3 in a budget phone battle royale. Now I've got full reviews on both of these devices. You can check out all of my thoughts individually and then all of the camera tests and speaker tests. We just want to do a quick rundown on the various features between these two handsets and how I feel about them. Immediately we're going to notice size differences between these two phones. This is a 5.5-inch display, this is a 5.7-inch display, but the Alcatel has one of the best screen-to-body ratios of any smartphone released this year, even with its front-facing stereo speakers. We're also dealing with the resolution advantage on the Alcatel. Not only is this a smaller screen, but it's also a 1080p LCD as opposed to the 720p LCD found on the Lumia 640. And for folks out there with maybe slightly poorer eyesight, I don't know that the resolution is really going to help much on the smaller screen when you just need physically larger dimensions to be able to see what's going on in your social media, on your email. But when we get into fine detail, like on high resolution photos, it's just a clear advantage for the Alcatel. All in the fine detail, like all these little furry fuzzies on this butterfly, all of these little wispy tendrils and fuzzy elements on these plants. It's less of an advantage when you're just farting around on Facebook, but if you're really into photography apps, video, if you just want those types of features, the Alcatel is a clear winner. Now, I was also ready to hand the Alcatel a victory for screen brightness and color saturation, because I always forget on Windows Phone just how spread out a lot of those settings are. So if we come into my settings here, and we've got our wireless settings, we can go down and there's lock screen. So lock screen has one of the timeout settings. Then we're gonna come down to brightness. So there's a brightness setting here that I can adjust either automatically or into 3 levels. So then you think, oh, well, if I have it in high brightness and it's still not as bright as the Alcatel, that must be it. But no, there's also an additional display setting way further down in Windows 8.1, where we can also go through and adjust things like further brightness and color. So we can adjust the color brightness, the color profile and the brightness profile. I hit adjust on the brightness profile and I manually had to jack that all the way up. Out of the box, the 640XL, to preserve battery life, had the high brightness mode about a third of the way in, not even halfway. And so if you really want to juice up your screen, you have to do that yourself, and you have to know where that setting is. Otherwise, the screen on the 640XL doesn't look quite as impressive as it actually can look if you don't adjust some of those settings yourself. And they're both very able competitors, though I will give a subtle nod to the 640XL in terms of high brightness for outdoor viewability. If you have this phone set in auto mode, I think it's ever so slightly just a little bit easier to read the screen on the 640XL in sunlight than it is the Alcatel Idol 3, but I don't think either of these phones are really stacking up against, say, a Galaxy S6 or a Lumia 930. Just walking around the phone hardware here, the Idol 3 is just an impressively built phone for its price tag. It's phenomenally thin, we do have micro SD card slot expansion, and I'm super stoked to see a phone at this price point with this build dimensions featuring front-facing stereo speakers. That's another nod for the Alcatel Idol 3. Definitely listen to the speaker reviews we have for both of these phones. The Idol 3 just walks away with a handy victory, and it's starting to creep up on HTC territory. The speakers are that good. Though I gotta say, even after using this phone for a couple weeks, I absolutely hate the power button placement on the Idol 3. It's opposite where we normally have, where either all of your controls are on the same side, or the power button is on the right and the volume rocker is on the left. Putting the power button on the left just totally confuses my muscle memory for every other phone I've ever used. I also have a minor gripe with how far up the camera module is positioned on the Idol 3, is when you're holding this like a camera, it's very easy for the pads of your fingers to start creeping in on the upper corner of your photos. I mentioned this in my full camera review, where I went through a whole day of shooting and had to toss out quite a few shots because I didn't notice it from the viewfinder, but when I went and put it on my larger computer monitor, you would see this little foggy shadow start rolling in from the side. It's kind of frustrating. It's just a muscle memory. It's a habit you have to get into to make sure that your fingers are just gripping the sides of the phone and aren't pushing forward to partially block the camera sensor. I just really dig this brush finished on the back of the Idol 3. There's nothing about this phone design which advertises that it's a cheap phone. You pull this thing out in public and people are gonna think you have just any other regular Android Premier flagship smartphone. Though I really do wish we could remove this backplate, get to the battery, have easier access to the SIM card in the memory card slot, but those aren't terrible compromises to make given this price point. Now, moving over to the Lumia 640, this is still a fine phone. I think this is still built really well. I like the design and I like the implementation. I'm still really thankful that Microsoft continues to play with matte plastics as opposed to glossy plastics, especially on their entry-level, lower-budget devices. I think these age better over time. I think they look less cheap, but this is also a super plain build. Nothing really stands out about this device other than the fact that it's kind of a large phone. Like the Idol 3, I don't think anyone's gonna look at this and say, oh, that's an ultra cheap phone. They must be super cheap people. But I think this looks a little less professional, a little less stylish than the Idol 3. We have a lot of extra plastic running around the sides of this phone. The screen to bezel ratio isn't quite as nice as Alcatel's solution, and it is a noticeably thicker device. And it's really easy to see how much thinner the Idol 3 is over the 640XL, which you would think for that thickness advantage, we'd get a bigger battery, but we're dealing with a 2900 milliamp hour cell in the Idol 3 and only a 3000 milliamp hour cell in the 640XL. And while Windows Phone does use resources more efficiently, the larger screen, and especially if you crank the brightness, battery life has been a lot more similar than I thought it would be. I really thought this was going to be a runaway victory for the 640, but the Alcatel holds up fairly well. I'm still giving the nod to battery life for the 640XL, but I thought this was going to be a humongous victory given the similar specs and the similar form factors, when really I'll end my day with around 10% more battery on the Lumia than I will on the Alcatel. Depending on what kind of usage you go through, what services, what kind of background apps you have running, that's a pretty close window that almost starts to approach margin of error in terms of usage. And I am giving the Lumia just a bigger nod in terms of lifestyle and ergonomic features. One, it's pretty easy to peel off the backplate, get to the battery if you ever need to replace the battery, and it's a little easier to get into your micro SD card and SIM card slots since you don't need to have a pin tool to access a door on the side of the phone. Power button lines up almost perfectly with where my thumb naturally rests on the side of the device, plus we also have tap to wake features on the Lumia 640XL. Just a nice touch, especially say you're left-handed and you don't want to reach a finger over to the side. You can always just double tap quick with your thumb. You'll have a glance screen, double tap, slide up, and you're into your phone. Very easy, very ergonomic touches. It's a nice lifestyle consideration for how people might interact with a larger screen device. Now, at this price point, UI performance used to be a runaway victory for Microsoft's operating system for Windows 8, but Alcatel has stepped up to a Qualcomm 600 series chipset, I believe it's a 615, as opposed to Microsoft continuing to use the Qualcomm 400 series chipset. This gives the Alcatel just enough oomph, just enough horsepower to help push Android 5.0 over some of that laggy, stuttery edge, which makes it a handier competitor to the fluidity of the live tile operating system. I know it's kind of a silly test, but just taking a couple quick flicks, it's a lot harder to make this lag over previous Qualcomm 400 series phones. Even getting into your settings and scrolling through lists and menus, it's a much smoother experience than I would have expected on an Android device at this price point. While Windows Phone 8.1 treats us to a wonderfully smooth UI navigation experience, the only thing that kind of hitches a little is how the notification shade pulls. And it's a two-stage shade, so that you can get into some quick toggles and then get into the rest of your notifications, but that's one of the few areas where this thing starts to get a little twitchy. It's just the little details, like being able to hide your controls down at the bottom. Since both of these phones utilize on-screen controls, you can reclaim just that little extra strip of pixels down at the bottom if you really want it. Both of these phones have solid 13 megapixel cameras capable of 1080p video at 30 frames per second. I have full camera reviews for both of these devices. You can see how they compare in real-world conditions. But in terms of the hardware, I do want to give just the subtle tap to the Lumia for having a camera module which isn't built out towards an upper corner of the device. It makes it a little bit easier to hold onto the phone, use it as a camera, not worry about blocking your camera sensor while you're trying to shoot photos and videos. Now, in terms of the camera apps, I absolutely adore the Lumia camera software. We've got very quick toggles for things like the flash or an HDR mode or swapping back and forth to the selfie camera or the rear camera, and simple flicks will quickly bring out settings that we can adjust in real time without walking away from our composition window. The difference between shooting full auto where making professional style adjustments is only a flick away, and we can very quickly augment or adjust these settings for the style of photography or video that we want to shoot. The Alcatel camera app is a very full-featured camera app, but it does require more navigation to get to the same settings. Unlike the Lumia, we don't have separate photo and video modes. We only have a photo shutter and a video shutter, and I do like that adaptation in that from the same composition window, you can decide in real time whether or not you want to shoot a photo or shoot video. On the Lumia, you do have that split-second toggle between photo and video, and maybe that makes the difference between you capturing a moment or missing it. But the only other controls that we have on the front face are the flash controls and swapping back and forth between the rear camera and the front-facing camera. Everything else requires us to start digging into these menus. Getting into an HDR photo, for example. On the Lumia, I can turn it on, I can turn it off. It's one tap directly from that front face. On the Alcatel, however, I have to hit this little menu key, which brings up this cute little animation. Then I tap the HDR and it pulls me back into the camera composition window. And ditto manual mode. I have to hit this menu, I go into manual mode. I don't get any options on the main composition window. I have to come into this option here in the upper left-hand corner, and now I can adjust things like white balance, manual focus, shutter speed, and ISO. These are all very helpful. This is a wonderful setup for really nailing down exactly the style of photo you want to shoot, but it takes multiple menu presses to get to the same features you can just flick on a Lumia. And lastly, we can talk about software support. In the month or so that I've had both of these phones, I've gotten 3 minor critical bug fixes and update patches on the Lumia 640XL, and I've gotten bupkis on the Idol 3. So at this lower price point, one of the compromises we're making is I think we've got slightly better hardware in terms of screen and speakers, but I think Microsoft is also looking at the cost it takes to properly support a modern day budget handset when we're working at razor thin margins. And I think they're building in just a little bit more of the support costs into this device by making those compromises and having the 720p screen and the not so great rear speaker. But ultimately, this is a really exciting comparison as we're looking at 2 devices in 2 different ecosystems which ask very few compromises for people to pick these up as their daily drivers. Floating between that $250 and $280 price point, you walk out the door with a very well-rounded smartphone experience. And it's particularly exciting as we're finally starting to see Android catch up. Spec for spec, you can't really compare these 2 devices just on the bullet points on pieces of paper. This phone would win because it has the faster processors with the more giggle flips. But it doesn't really work that way, as Android soaks up resources less efficiently than Windows Phone does. But now at that sub $300 price point, you walk out the door with a phone that doesn't feel quite as compromised. And you all should know by now that wherever my individual personal bias might lead me, the one thing I'm always going to be super stoked about is better competition. That's what improves our devices, and that's why we're seeing phones at the entry level and budget end of the spectrum start to get really good. And while neither of these phones will properly compete against a phone like the Galaxy S6 or the LG G4, they also don't feel like they're $400 cheaper than a Galaxy S6 or an LG G4. And that means the whole market from entry level to mid-range to high-end is gonna have to take a step up if we're starting to get phones this good at the low end. But of course, I want to hear from you folks. As we're starting to look at phones that are inexpensive to own and operate, what features do you care most about when you're picking up a budget handset? If you're a savvy shopper out there looking to save a little cash on your next smartphone purchase, which set of features are going to convince you to part with your cash? Definitely drop me a comment down below. Those are the kinds of conversations I love getting into. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe for more comparisons like these. And I would not be able to continue producing on this channel if you all weren't out there supporting me via the fan funding links, shopping on my Amazon affiliate links, or by sharing these videos on social sites like Facebook and Twitter and Google Plus and the Reddit. So please keep bringing more cool people to the party. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next comparison.